Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Why Employee Financial Wellbeing Matters. I'm Brian Goodman, WPA's Director of Large Corporate Business. Research shows that 59% of employees say that financial concerns prevent them from performing at their best, and 1 in 4 workers have lost sleep over it. Only 40% of people feel that they have good control of their money. And yet, individuals with higher levels of financial stress take nearly double the amount of work absence as others. Whichever way you look at it, financial concerns impact mental well-being and productivity at work, and that has to be of significant concern for businesses. We're pleased today to have Andrew Craig, a director at pension management firm Isio, to drill into employee financial well-being and why it matters, and the role employers can play in nurturing. Next slide, please. Now, before I hand over to Andrew, there will be time at the end for questions. So if anything springs to mind in the next 15 minutes, please click the questions tab in this window. And if the window isn't there, just click on the white arrow on the red background and it should appear. So without further ado, over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Brian, and hi, everybody. So the premise of this talk is that helping staff's financial health is good for both staff themselves and for corporate success. And in the next 15 minutes, I'd just like to unpack that premise a little bit with you, and I want to focus upon 3 areas. So firstly, what does financial well-being really mean? Secondly, what's the role of the employer in supporting financial well-being? And then thirdly, how might you go about it? Now, financial well-being is one of those phrases that probably 10 years ago, most of us had never heard. And yet now it's one that we come across all of the time. But actually it tends to get used in quite different contexts, and therefore people don't always mean the same thing by it. And so I thought it might be helpful, first of all, just for us to have a look at the government's definition of what financial well-being means. And so I've popped up on the screen here the definition from the Money and Pensions Service, and let's read it through. It is about feeling secure and in control. It is knowing that you can pay the bills today, can deal with the unexpected, and are on track for a healthy financial future. In short, confident and empowered. And I'd like you just to note that there's 2 components of that definition. There's a circumstantial component about being able to pay the bills, about being in a position to deal with the unexpected, and being on track for a healthy financial future. But there's also an important emotional aspect about feeling secure and in control, and about feeling confident and empowered. And I'd like to come back to that second bit a bit later on in our discussion. So let's look at the government's position. So as many of you will know, there's a government strategy for dealing with financial wellbeing that's running from 2020 to 2030. And there are 5 components to that strategy. The first one is in helping children and young people be better educated in order to deal with their finances. The second is in dealing with financial resilience, making sure that people who are working but are potentially financially squeezed have got the savings behind them to deal with those sort of rainy day crises. The third is reducing reliance upon credit, and particularly reliance upon credit for food and for bills. The fourth is providing better debt advice for those who need it. And the fifth is helping all of us to more effectively save for later in life. And I think these are all aspirations that I'm sure we would all support as concerned citizens. But the question arises as to which of these are just the responsibility of the government, or which of these fall upon us when we're supporting employers, or if we're responsible for an employer's program that we need to pick up. Now, Brian, in his introduction, gave you some statistics around the issues on financial well-being. Here's another one from the Centre for Economics and Business Research. I'll just leave it on screen. I'll not read that through to you. But you'll see that there are different numbers that float around, and that's because it's quite difficult to really quantify exactly the impact of poor financial well-being. But intuitively, the case is pretty clear that if at the end of the day we're at work, but we're stressed because we're worrying about money, or we're not at work because that stress has reached a point that we can't do that, that is not going to be good for either individuals or for corporate success. And so for me, the case for employers managing or supporting financial well-being is self-evident. The question really comes down to, as an employer, which of these aspects of this should you be focusing upon? And that leads to our second question, which is, what's the role of the employer in this process? And there is no single right answer to that question. And so it can be helpful to step back and to think about what's the issue in your particular organization that you're trying to address. And let's just look at some of these boxes here. So let's start with top left. For some people, it's about addressing specific issues within the organization. So a good question to ask might be, how does poor financial well-being present in your organization today? What is it that the HR function is having to deal with? Maybe what's the data that's coming out through your EAP program feedback? And what's behind any stress-related absence that you're experiencing? But it's also helpful to think about what are the issues that might present tomorrow that aren't presenting today. I've got a client of mine who employs people, and they tend to sort of work for the organization throughout their careers. And a lot of the individuals are doing quite heavy physical labor. And one of the concerns of this organization is that if they don't help those individuals have adequate retirement provision in place, by the time they get to the stage that they can't physically work, that's going to be a problem for the individuals, and it's going to be a problem for the organization as it has to manage that situation. So that's a good example where that's not an issue for them today, but they can see that if they don't address it, it's an issue tomorrow. And therefore for them, that's a really big driver in their wellbeing program. Stepping across to the top right, for other organizations, it's a bit more about the employee deal or the employee value proposition. I work with another organization who have committed to employees that they will support colleagues at every stage of life. And yet they recognize that historically in their benefits, there are areas of life that they haven't supported as well as others. And that takes us to this whole issue of inclusion. And quite often traditional benefit programs that have got a particular focus around retirement don't do a great job of being really inclusive, particularly for perhaps younger employees and less well-paid employees. And so perhaps they might support retirement, but they don't support issues like helping people to kind of deal with financial resilience or save up to buy their first house or dealing with debt. That translates down to the bottom left and this whole issue about value for money. And so even if there isn't a paternal aspect to this for some organization, ultimately, if the benefits that an organization is providing does not really scratch the itch, if I can use that phrase, for the employees that it's supporting, you're going to get poor engagement with those benefits. And as a result, you're going to get poor value for money for the amount that you're spending on it. And then lastly, stepping over to the right-hand side, organizations will also be thinking about what's their social contribution. So if we go back to that government policy, just from a values point of view, what do you want to do to support the most vulnerable people within your organization? So there's lots and lots of different reasons why organizations might do this, and it's really important to think about why before you decide how to approach this. But as we move to the approach, one of the things you need to think quite carefully about is the data that you've got and the data that you don't. Clearly, there's some stuff, for example, like plotting your workforce by age and salary, and you can start to build up a profile and think about what their needs might be. But lots of the data that you'd really like to get the design of your wellbeing program, stuff like the level of indebtedness within your workforce, the degree of financial resilience employees have got, and also crucially, the level of confidence they've got of managing their finances is probably data that you don't have. And therefore, one of the decisions you've got to make is, do you go about trying to get that from employees in some way, which may not be easy to do, or do you rely upon generic data? So for example, if you're looking at your workforce and thinking about who might need help buying a house, do you go and ask employees what their position is, or do you go to national statistics that will tell you that outside of London, the average person buys a house at 32 and they need a £50,000 deposit? Once you've thought about the data, you can then start to think about, okay, what's the design of the program? And this slide here looks at a typical life journey. Now, obviously, we're all slightly different, but if you follow that journey through, left to right, maybe at the start of working life, individuals are coming into the workforce. Perhaps they've got student debt. Perhaps they're coming out of an apprenticeship program, starting to save for the first time, trying to get a bit of cash behind them, maybe wanting to move out from home, buy a car. So those needs can be quite short term. Maybe then an individual starts to think about, okay, how am I going to buy a house, and working out what deposit they need to save. And then maybe moving into starting a family and the financial commitments that go with that. And then perhaps wanting to move into a bigger house and taking on a bigger mortgage. And then by the time an individual gets to mid-career, they're starting to think more about savings, maybe thinking about how might they support their children through university, for example, starting to pay down their big mortgage, and starting to think a bit more about retirement and what that's going to look like and what they might need. And of course, we're all different, and that journey will look different to all of us. But the key thing is that you can look at that for your workforce, and you can think about the likely needs your employees have got. And then you can look at your benefit program and think about to what extent do the benefits you provide align well with those needs. And either that will validate the approach that you've got, or it will flush out some of the gaps that you need to plug. And the good news is that in the market now, actually, there are lots of decent solutions that can help you to plug those gaps. But it's easy to think about this just in terms of financial products. And I want to go back to the point I'd made at the beginning around that definition, about the fact that actually it's circumstantial and emotional. And actually giving people the sort of emotional support, helping them to feel confident and in control and empowered in terms of managing their finances is completely vital. I want to give you an example just from my own circumstances. I had to recently change my laptop. And so I went onto the John Lewis website. I'm not great on technology. And I looked at the various options, and there were laptops from a few £100s up to laptops to kind of well over £1,000. And actually, as I read the information, really, I didn't know too much about which chips were good or bad, or how much RAM I needed, or what types of USB and HDMI ports I needed, and the trends that might mean I needed different ones in future. And the whole thing was really quite intimidating because I just didn't have the skills to be able to deal with that. There were some helpful guides that I read, and that helped me to kind of get a bit closer to a decision. And eventually I picked a laptop and I popped it into my basket. And I got to that point that you'll probably recognize where I sort of hovered over the buy it button. But actually, I just didn't have the confidence to press the button because I just wasn't certain I was making the right decision. And I did what a lot of us did in that situation, and I procrastinated. I just didn't complete the purchase. And ultimately, I then went and phoned a friend who knew what he was talking about, and he guided me through the purchase, and I now have a laptop I'm very happy with. Why have I told you that story? Because actually managing your finances for most people is more complicated than going and buying a laptop. And actually, if your benefit program doesn't have a suitable phone a friend option, actually you're probably not going to effectively manage that emotional aspect. So when you're thinking about the design, don't just think about what products do we put there, but also think crucially about how you're going to provide that support. So in summary, there's lots of good reasons to take supporting financial well-being seriously. And my suggestion to you would be that you focus upon 4 aspects. 1, be really clear about why your organization is trying to address financial well-being. What is the issue that you're trying to address? 2, get the data that you can to inform that design, because that will help you to do a better job. Thirdly, evolve the benefits that you provide so that they meet the needs right through the life cycle of the people that you've got. And fourthly, and crucially, make sure that you build in some form of phone a friend option that's going to give that confidence and empowerment to people to manage their finances well, because without that, it isn't going to work effectively. So that's the end of my reflections. I'll pass back to Brian to facilitate questions.
Thanks, Andrew. Really interesting presentation, which I think highlights a number of important issues for businesses to consider. Now, we've had a number of questions being asked, and here's the first. You mentioned at the beginning about the government strategy having a particular focus on the most vulnerable. So how does this differ from the approach employers are taking?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Brian. So it comes back to this question of what's the issue that you're trying to address. So if we go back to where the government is, you'll notice that if you look at those components, there's a bit about supporting children, which employers might do as part of their social contribution, but probably isn't going to be a primary driver for them. And then you've got 3 that are about dealing with people who, if you like, are in the most vulnerable position. And many workforces will have people who are also in vulnerable positions, and it's therefore important to think about that when you're designing these types of plans, but that will differ significantly across organizations. So for some, that will be the primary driver of this, and it might be that supporting debt, for example, or financial resilience is the primary focus. In other organizations, their goals will be really quite different, and they might have quite low incidences of poor financial resilience, and the focus might be a bit more on people further through the sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you like, and are focusing upon long-term savings. So for some, there'll be a good overlap, but some will be quite different.
Okay. You also talked about collecting financial data in addition to the sort of data that most companies will already hold. But some of that data could be hugely sensitive. I mean, do companies need to think about anything special about permissions or who collates it, who sees it, and how that sort of information is stored?
Yeah, no, you're right, and I think there's a limit to the type of data that you might go and get, and how you go about finding it. In my experience, though, when organisations have set about evolving their benefits to support well-being, they've done it in quite an open way, and they've talked to employees about the journey that they're going on and the fact that they want to kind of align benefits to this life cycle, and that they need to collect a certain amount of information. And that's allowed organizations to go and get, if you like, the next level of data. So somebody's not going to tell you, how much debt they're in all likelihood, and that's not a question you'd ask. But for example, you might ask, in the context of an overall survey, are you able to clear your credit card, or do you clear your credit card at the end of each month? And so you can kind of start to get little indicators about where people are that can be really helpful in terms of informing the design. And other aspects, people are quite happy to tell you how confident they feel in managing their money, and they're quite happy to tell you whether they own a house or not, for example. So other aspects of that you can get.
Okay, I liked your laptop analogy. I thought that was very strong. But how do people go about improving their financial decision-making process? Is it about workshops, reading newspapers, webinars, or sort of one-to-one sessions with financial advisors?
Yeah, so probably all of those. And so certainly when I think about it, I tend to think about a program, and it's probably helpful to think about the confident and the unconfident. So for the confident, often people will want to self-manage, and for those people, you need to just provide them with access to the right resources. So that might be educational materials, either your own or the providers that you've got, or there's lots of sort of central stuff that's quite good. So for example, the government's Money Helper website, I think, is excellent, an excellent resource for people. The bigger challenge is for those people who have got a bigger confidence gap. And I think for them, my view is that financial coaching or financial advice has got a really crucial role to play in benefit design, because for a lot of people, they just need that hand holding, that phone a friend option. And that's an area that's really developing. And I personally, I think is a critical component to a complete benefit program.
Well, on that, so I'm sort of guessing that engagement levels and, shall we say, knowledge levels differ by whether it be by age groups, job types, or perhaps many other factors. Are there any specific groups where take up is particularly low when really it really should be much higher? Then there's a big gap at a really important time.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting actually. It's always dangerous to sort of draw too many assumptions, but there is an interesting challenge that we've noticed, that sort of the Generation Z, I can't quite bring myself to go Generation Z in the UK, so you'll have to forgive me, those of you who are right on message here, but Generation Z, I think, do have a different approach, and it's fair to say that is a population that you would really want to get to, because they're fairly early on in their careers and laying the right platform is right. But organizations are finding they're having to slightly flex their approach for that generation compared to other generations in terms of how they engage with this stuff.
Okay, and what are the sort of strategy you touched on that, but what strategy should companies really be looking to adopt to try and get employees engaged in financial education?
Yeah, I mean, for me, there's a huge lesson for benefit design, I think, in the sort of historical story of pensions. And if you look at stakeholder pensions being brought in 2001, which gave everybody access to a pension scheme, and take-up was very low. And then we saw the transition to auto-enrollment in 2012, and since then participation has been outstanding. Now, that's not because I think people were fundamentally different in 2001 and 2012, but I think that the design of your program needs to have a default pathway that helps people to do sensible things by default, because otherwise people won't opt into them. So for me, the key thing to unlocking it is to having a design program which probably includes access to this stuff that employees can opt out of if they don't want it. But I think if you leave those things on an opt-in basis, it isn't going to work, because often the most vulnerable people are the people who will struggle to engage. And so unless you almost put it in their path so they have to avoid it, they're probably not going to get the help they need.
Okay, and do you see this as something which is sort of financial skills and improvement knowledge? Is that something which should be being rolled out across everyone within a company, or should it be forming part of a sort of flexible benefits packages? What changes do you see employers making to their benefit arrangements for staff?
Yeah, so it's been an evolution, I would say, and over the last few years as to how that's evolved. And so I guess in the past, people have just provided a bunch of benefits, say in a benefit program, and said, off you go, kind of make your own decision, and if you want to go and get advice, go and get it. In recent years, there's been much more of a focus on education, and I would really support that. And I think education has got an important role to play in the benefit program. But I think the latest iteration is now a bit like, as we were talking about a moment ago, then looking past education and saying, well, even education will get you so far, but if it's education you have to choose to engage with, it's not going to be really effective. And therefore, you need to work out your intervention. And there's lots of ways to do that. So a simple example would be when people join your organization, what happens in the induction process? Do you take people? That's a great opportunity to get people to really understand your benefits and to think about how they use them. But if you give a sort of a passing 10-minute introduction in that process and leave it to individuals, that's going to get a different outcome than if you were going to really grab that opportunity and support people.
Okay, and we've got time for one final question. So what sort of data is available to demonstrate the improvements which are being made by those companies which are adopting these sorts of changes?
Yeah, so we're still very early on in the kind of this transition to financial wellbeing. So one of the real challenges is probably not as much as we'd like to be there, but we can start to see a picture. And certainly the organizations that I've been working with, it's been much more about building individual KPIs. And we talked before about the stuff you can go and get. So for example, if we're surveying as part of our benefit survey employees and asking them about their confidence level, okay, tracking how has that confidence level changed. We can track the contribution choices people make. And then if you've got individual campaigns as part of your engagement strategy, so for example, if you were doing a campaign on helping people to look at an ISA option or to look at pensions, you can go and look at the MI that's coming out of the sort of follow through journeys and the modelers and the like that you're making available. And so you can start to build a picture, but I think it's going to take a little bit of time, I think, for the real analytics to kind of give that compelling data that sometimes a CFO would love to see.
Okay. Well, look, it's clear that employee financial health is a key matter for companies, and it's also an area which many organizations are now looking at much more closely. I'm particularly grateful to Andrew for his time and thoughts. Thank you all too for coming. I hope you found it as interesting and useful as I did.